here. It's sort of like a tradition when they do the readings to mention letters because letters have a meaning. Each Hebrew letter has a significance in itself. If you say L in English, it doesn't mean anything, but not in Hebrew. Not only that, it has a numerical meaning too, because they don't have numbers, 1, 2, 3. They use the alphabet for the numbers. And actually, Lamed stands for heart. And Gimel, which is like our G, basically L is like our G, stands for reward, punishment. And I think that what the reader is doing is saying, okay, here we're going to the heart of the matter. And the heart is very important, as have you noticed in the whole book, from the beginning in the chapter 6, with the first commandment. And it's really the first commandment chronologically in the covenant has to do with love God with all your heart, and strength and mind. So, and then the rewards and punishments. So that's constantly in the whole covenant. Not just the heart of the people, but the heart of God, I think, and that connection there. And then the rewards and punishments. And that's, it's interesting that in the blessing in chapter 33, we find that we have also the idea of reward, but also punishment. That's part of the covenant. So, he also uses the word parasha, which means portion. That's another thing that he adds. And then the portion, this is the last portion, is the chapter 33 and 34. It's read together. Once they have finished reading that in a synagogue, it lasts for a whole year. They go back to Genesis, and for an entire year they read again the Torah. The Torah is the heart of the Jewish faith and the synagogue, of the Jewish faith and the synagogue. Now, there's a lot of other books in the Bible, but what is read regularly and systematically is the Torah, which is the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Moses, the law. So they'll go back immediately once this is finished reading. They'll go back the next Sabbath and begin again with Genesis. And all of these books are divided in portions, like you say, exactly so that it falls for a whole year. So this is the last one, and it's called barakah. You might have heard it, but barakah is blessing. Sometimes the Hebrew words are very close to the English, and that's another interesting thing, just like the letters are. There are a lot of that. It's the blessing which Moses, the man of God, now he's called here, Moses is called the man of God, and I want to kind of look at that a little bit because there's different words, for God, different names for God, and here he uses the word Elohim. And there are different words for man, and he used the word Ish. And the reason that's important is because that brings us back to Genesis, the first 2 chapters. God is revealed, just generally speaking, God is revealed in the Old Testament in creation, Elohim. He's revealed to Abraham as the all-powerful God, El Shaddai, and he's revealed to Moses as the one who makes a covenant, the eternal one, Yahweh. Now, in the reading, in fact, of course, you don't understand Hebrew, but in the reading, he never said Yahweh, he said Adonai. And if you go to synagogue, they will never pronounce the name because you shall not pronounce the name of God in vain. Or they put that, they get very extreme in that, so they don't want to pronounce it at all. And even though it's in Hebrew, it's written in Hebrew, but they all say Adonai. They will never pronounce the name like we would say Yahweh or Jehovah. And you notice their English Bible does the same thing. The Lord came from Sinai. The Lord with capital letters, that's actually Yahweh, Jehovah. So that's an interesting question how that came about. But it's interesting to know that this is the name of God here, the Lord revealed to Moses. But right before the man of God, that's Ish, Elohim. Ish and Isha is the word man, the name given to man. And Isha is very close to the same word in the feminine form of that we find in the beginning in Genesis. It brings us back, I think, to the God of creation, the man of God. Now that expression, man of God, is not used for everybody. In fact, it's used for 13 people specifically in the Old Testament and 1 person in the New Testament. And I want to ask you this is a little tricky question. Who do you think the word man of God, the expression man of God, used only once in the New Testament, is used about? Probably hard to know. I wouldn't have guessed if you asked me like that. It's used only of Timothy. Only Timothy is called man of God in the New Testament. It doesn't mean the others are not, but that's interesting. So man of God is used about 78 times in the Old Testament. It's used for Moses a lot, used for David, used for Elijah, for Elisha, and a few other individuals. Some actually that are mentioned only once or twice in the Old Testament, and just a name that appears like that, and it's called man of God. And important prophets, like Isaiah, are not even called man of God. So kind of interesting, the man of God. And so I think that's interesting. So before his death, some people think even the day that he died, because he did a lot of things the day he died. He wrote a song. He blessed the people. So I don't know if it's really about. That's the Jewish tradition. So the Lord came from Sinai. Okay, now notice that he locates the relationship here with Israel. The blessing. He goes back. He doesn't go back to Abraham. He doesn't go back before, or Jacob even. He goes back to the Lord who came from Sinai, or from Seir. Seir is the same mountain region, and Sinai is there. So he kind of brings it back to Sinai. This is where really the covenant was made, the first covenant. This is sort of like a second, but it's a confirmation of the first covenant. So it's after the Exodus. He brings that. That's where he describes God. Coming, he's shown forth from Mount Paran. He shines. God. The idea here is the God who shines, whose glory, whose light. You remember Moses came down from the mountain. What was his face like? It was shining. In fact, he couldn't even look at it. That's pretty impressive. He's the God who shines. It's also, you remember how it is also at Sinai. Is the thunder and the noises and the trumpets and all these strange things, that happen. But he came from the 10,000s of holy ones. Now that's an interesting description, going back to Sinai, the giving of the law. He's talking about God coming from the 10,000s of holy ones with flaming fire at his right hand. Who are these holy ones? These tens of thousands. Who are those who are flaming fires? Well, if you do a study of that in the Bible, we'll know that's about the angels. It's the angels. Stephen, preaching in Acts 7, mentions twice in his sermon the role of these angels in the giving of the law. In fact, we learn from Stephen that the law was actually given by the angels. The commandments were given by the angels. They were used by God in giving the law. Hebrews 1, verse 6 talks about the angels also as flames of fire there in that text. So they're there. So then he talks about these angels as the holy ones in the heavenly places. And then he continues, yes, he loved his people. All his holy ones were in his hand. So the relationship of God here, giving the law and the commandments and making a covenant, is a relationship of love. And that's kind of different from what I've said up to now, because if we talk about the covenants, the sovereign treaties, the treaties is the covenants that were made, like we talked about, examples we have in the Hittite nations, were always covenants based on subjection and getting the most out of these smaller nations they could. You give your gold, you give your this, you give your that, and we'll control you. But the covenant that God makes is out of love. Out of love for this people that he brought out of Egypt. That's what he says, huh? He loved his people. All his holy ones were in his hand. God looks at his people as holy, as sanctified, as set apart. And he says they were in his hand. They followed his steps, receiving direction from you. The Hebrew here has the word devarim, which means words. I don't know why the English Standard has. Does anybody have a different translation here? I have direction from you. Anybody has words or commandments or anything like that? No? What do you have?
Words.
Okay, words. What's your translation? I'm curious.
The American Standard.
Oh, wow. Very interesting. Often the American Standard does a good job. Sometimes I don't know which Bible to choose because it's words, but it's okay. Direction. I prefer words. To me, it's more concrete because, that's what God did. He spoke. He didn't just give direction. He kindly told them, with words, So When Moses, and any specific in the context is clear, receiving direction or words from you, when Moses commanded us a law, the Hebrew actually has law in the beginning of the phrase. And that's important in the biblical languages because the order of words are very important in the ancient languages. If you put words in the beginning, that means that's where the emphasis is. It's not on Moses, the emphasis, it's on the Torah. People who read that, they get all those details, like, oh, it's the law that matters, huh? Okay. The law was commanded by Moses as a possession for the assembly of Jacob. Does anybody have another word here besides possession? You have an American Standard. Anybody has another word for possession? No? You all have possession? Okay. Actually, the word actually means an inheritance. An inheritance. That's the literal meaning of the word. And I think it's important to understand this idea of as an inheritance, because that's a different concept. Just a possession. Because an inheritance is something you receive freely. You get it as a gift, from your father or from someone who gives it to you. And it's also part of the idea of covenant, because we find that in the New Testament. Testament, Christ, the book of Hebrews, Christ died, and so he established a new testament. And the idea of testament there is also the idea of when anybody makes a testament. You get something from that testament. So it's pretty interesting. So Moses commanded us the law as a possession, inheritance for the assembly of Jacob. Thus, and this is a very important verse, thus the Lord, Yahweh, became king in Jeshurun. Jeshurun is the poetical name for Jacob, for Israel, mentioned already before. It comes from a Hebrew word, yatzar, which means to be straight, to be upright. At that point, God saw his people as upright, following him, listening to him. God, it didn't last, but that's how he saw him. He saw them. Now, notice the Lord became king at that point. And that's a very important verse because we know how the story continues. Of course, we have after that the book of Joshua with the book of Judges. And then later on we have Samuel, and we find out that later on, under Samuel, who is a judge and a prophet, under Samuel, then the elders of the people come to Samuel and they want a king. You remember that story? And God says, it's not you they rejected, it's me. They reject me as king. We want to be like the other nations. Everything had been okay at this point. As soon as they establish a man as king, they get into big trouble. Into a lot of trouble. In fact, in that text there in Samuel, God warns them. Here's what's going to happen if you have a king. This. And why do you think that's the case? For me, a simple reason. Because the king is a human being. And to have a human being with a lot of power is never a very good idea. I guess humans learned with centuries, it may be a good idea to separate powers, It may be they did learn that. It's never a good idea to give too much power to a human being. In fact, in the law, actually, later on in the law, God even established the fact that the king that was there shouldn't have any power, any prophetical power, and any priestly power. Now, especially priestly, because later on David has prophetical powers, but especially could not be a priest. So the separation of powers, we might say, it's possible. So the Lord became king in Jacob, in Israel. So he was the king. He was the one who was to be the Lord of the people, of his people. If we study the history of the church from the beginning, the history of the church, what do we see? The same phenomenon as in Israel. Progressively, the church, as it grows, it becomes more influential. The church wants to have men at the top. And the hierarchy becomes more and more significant, more and more important, until you come to a point where there is one man who is the head of the whole church. That happens around the 1600s. Progressively, the Pope, the father, that means father, patriarch, all the bishops of the ancient world were called Pope before. That's a Latin term, patriarchs in Greek. It became one patriarch, one leader for the whole church. And I don't think that was what Jesus wanted, because in the Bible, from what I can read, who is the head of the church? Jesus. It's very clear. a number of passages in Ephesians, the first chapter, and other passages. We only have one head of the church, is that Jesus. And we talked to that. I've talked a lot with people about that, and it's interesting the arguments they bring up, because one of the arguments will say, "Well, how can he be the head of the church? We can't see him." I mean, if we have a head, we have to see him. Well, what about the king? What about God being the king of Israel in the Old Testament? Could they see God? Do they have to see God for him to be the king? Why do they have to have a human being? Why do they have to give so much power to a human being? Is it not that they don't have faith enough in God, and especially in his word? Because if he's spoken, well, we have his will. That's really what matters, is having his will. So that's always been a problem. And the role of men in the church is a fascinating history, how the history of the church, the history, of Christendom, let's say, from beginning all the way to this day, we have this problem, of power and hierarchy and politics being mixed with the church, and kings who represent God, and absolute monarchies in France, and all kind of things going on. In fact, if it weren't for that, this country would not exist, because this country was founded basically because of that. There were people who came from Europe. They wanted to do something different. We know that from all the documents we have. As far as religion is concerned, and everybody believed in God. People who think that they didn't back then, everybody believed in God. They wanted something else than what's going on in England. So then we have, after all of that, we have all the tribes, and I'm not going to go through it, because it gives blessings to each tribe, and I don't want to go through that. There's other things I want to talk about before, because we don't have much time. One thing it is to notice about these blessings given to the tribes is that the blessings are not given in the order of the birth of the sons or the age of the sons of Jacob. They're not. Now, Reuben is the first older son, but after that, it's mixed. It's not in the order of birth. It's basically the same we find in Genesis 49, when Jacob blesses his sons. We have a little bit the same problem, but here even more. It's not in the regular order. And I think that poses a question, because you wonder why. Is there a reason why God did that? And I think there is. I think there's a reason why God didn't put them in the order and say, I bless you, and you start with the older one, then the one like that, and then the one and that one. What do you think that reason could be? Any idea? What is God trying to teach the people by doing that? By not giving preeminence to the age necessarily. What is God saying?
Traditions of man are not important to him.
Right, okay. But it's not so much what I'm thinking about, but you're right. But is not God teaching them that it's not the physical that matters? It's not the physical that matters, because the promised son was not the first one born to Abraham. Same thing with Isaac and Jacob. And that's an argument that Paul brings in the book of Romans. He says, no, it's not the first one born. It's the one I choose. Because, of course, we know that all the ancient traditions, it was the first one born that had all the privileges. Well, we understand that. That's a tradition. But God says, I'm going to break that tradition, because it's not like that. I look at the heart. I don't look at your stuff. Wow. God is countercultural. God is progressive. Human beings are not. Only God progresses. Only God allows us to progress in society. We don't. Human beings. We tend to go back, to drift back to what we were, I think, thousands of years ago. But God helps us to understand things. And I think that's the point. I may be wrong in that. Maybe somebody will send a comment, when they listen to these studies. Yann, why are you saying this? I don't understand. Yes? Yes. Yes, exactly. It's the heart and whoever is obeying him. And you could see that in the blessings. I don't want to go through all of them. Now, it's true that it's interesting that Simeon, for example, is not mentioned at all. Simeon, it's the big tribe. And you wonder why. Well, the rabbis have all kinds of explanations for that, but one of the things they say is that Simeon got into trouble several times in the Old Testament, so got too much. He created too much problems, so he's not even mentioned out here. So it shows the sovereignty of God. It shows that God can decide to bless who he wants, how he wants. Of course, he's fair, but we often In fact, we'll see that with Moses. We often think God is unfair. Moses said that once about God, and that's one too much. That God was not fair. I'll show you when he did that. 3 times Moses rebelled against God. We'll see that. I'm going to show you. And one time he said, "You're not fair with my people." God didn't like that. I mean, we lightly speak of God these days. We're so used to it, on TV and everybody says about God, all kind of things. But God has good ears, man. You can whisper, "You didn't hear me, He's got good eyes too. He can actually see through your brain. He actually is the one who makes your brain work. Oh, come on. And your ears work. He knows how it works. So I tell you. Reuben, just one thing about Reuben. Let Reuben live and not die, but let his men be few. I don't want to go into the details, but you remember maybe Reuben had something to do with Joseph, wanting to kill Joseph in the past. I don't know. It could be that. Anyway, I want to go into, like I said, I'm not going into all of these. It would be interesting. I just want to go to verse 26, because that's, to me, where the meat is, where the main stuff is here. In verse 26, where he goes back to exalting God, because that's really what counts. He goes back to exalting God. We wouldn't have much, and that's what I want to look at. There's none like God. I believe that's Elohim in the text. I believe that's the God of creation in the beginning. None like God, O Jeshurun, that's Jacob, Israel, who rides through the heavens to your help, through the skies in his majesty. That's very poetical, very beautiful. The majesty of God who rides to the help of his people. The eternal God is your dwelling place, and underneath are the everlasting arms. Look at this text. The eternal God is your dwelling place. They're going to enter the land, the promised land, and what is God saying here? That's not your dwelling place. This is temporary. This is nothing compared to the presence of God. That's what it means. And Stephen preaching in Acts 7 again, a lot to learn in Stephen when he preaches there in Acts 7. He was stoned. You remember what he said about God does not need to live in temples made by hands, human hands. Even quotes Isaiah 66, actually, that says that. We might go to Isaiah 66 if I can find it. I think it's in Isaiah 66. It's right at the last chapter of Isaiah. Beautiful text here, because it kind of parallels this text here. The eternal God is your dwelling place. Underneath are the everlasting arms and his majesty in heaven. Chapter 66 is quoted by Stephen in Acts 7. Thus says the Lord, heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool. What is the house that you would build for me? This is exactly what Stephen quotes in Acts 7. For what is the place of my rest? All these things my hand has made. All these things came to be, declares the Lord, but this is the one to whom I will look. He who is humble and contrite in spirit and trembles at my word. I'm not impressed with your buildings, with your temples, with your cities, with your armies, with your beautiful clothes, and I could go on and on and on and on, and your wealth, and on and on and on. Whatever impresses man, God is not impressed. That's the whole message here. It's powerful. And you understand maybe why they stoned him. They didn't like it, maybe. He told, like I said one time, if the prophets had not spoken, they would be alive still today. Not really, but it's because they spoke that they got killed. Well, anyway, so here's God, the God who is described, who liberated them from Egypt, who delivered them from the enemies right before this happened, before they can enter the land. A lot of nations came against them, the Amalekites, the Moabites, but God delivered them each time. So Israel lived in safety. Verse 28, Jacob lived alone in a land of grain and wine, whose heavens drop down dew. Safety is considered by every psychologist. Security and safety is considered like one of the greatest needs of human beings. Human beings need safety. Living in unsafety and in threat constantly is not very good for us. It gets us sick. It gets us to do bad stuff. So we need safety, and that's what God provided. Happy are you, O Israel, verse 29, who is like you, a people saved by the Lord. The shield of your help and the sword of your triumph. You remember Ephesians 6, the armor of God, the shield and the sword, mentioned here. Your enemies shall come fouling to you, and you shall tread upon their backs. Let's very quickly talk about Moses. Moses was not allowed. He's going to die on Mount Nebo, right there, close to the Jordan River, pretty high mountain. You can see the whole land. God will not let him go over. Verse 4, the Lord said to him, this is the land which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will give it to your offspring. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not go over there. So he died at 120 years old and did not see the land. Let me give you three reasons, three that I found in the Old Testament. In Exodus 4:13, when God spoke to Moses in the burning bush, Moses refused to go. He says, no, not me. We might take that lightly, but the text says God was angry at him. When God calls us to do something, it's not good to find excuses. God doesn't like that. That's the first example we have. Exodus 5:23, another one where something similar happened. I'll look at it. Exodus 5, because I'm not sure. I remember what it is exactly. Exodus 5:23. Oh, wow. Look at what Moses says to God. Look at the rebellion. We don't often talk about Moses like that, you know. But look, Exodus 5, verse 22. Then Moses turned to the Lord and said, O Lord, why have you done evil to this people? Why did you ever send me? For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done evil to this people, and you have not delivered your people at all. You have failed, God. You haven't done what you said you would do. Oh, okay. That's the second case where we see something here. And then number 16, of course, that's the biggie. In number 16, 29. I think it's in 29. It could be in 20, actually. It's in 20. We'll read the verses. There's a few verses of what happened. When God asked Moses to speak to the rock so that the water would come out. You could actually read before in verse 8, chapter 20, the book of Numbers. Here's what God says to Moses. Take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron, your brother, and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water. Because they complain, you know, we're thirsty and stuff like that. So you shall bring water out of the rock for them and give drink to the congregation and their cattle. Moses took the staff from before the Lord as he commanded him. Then Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, Hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock? Notice what he says. Shall we bring water out of this rock? They never could do anything like that. He could have said, Will God bring water out of this rock? No, it's shall we bring water out of this rock? And look what he says after that. Hear now. And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice. And water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank and their livestock. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, Because you did not believe in me, to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. These are the waters of Meribah, where the people of Israel quarreled with the Lord, and through them he showed himself holy. You see how strict God is here? Now today, you know what people would say to that? What's the matter? What's the difference between telling the rock for the water to come and hitting it? Oh, what's the point? The point is that water came out. We're very pragmatic, you know. As long as water comes out, who cares how you do it? Well, God cares how we do it. If God tells us to do a thing a certain way, I suppose he's got a reason. We can always say, for everything that we do as a church or as Christians, well, God didn't say I couldn't do that. God didn't say I couldn't do this or that. Well, yeah. But that's not the question. The fundamental question is not that. The question is not in our life, what can I do that God didn't tell me not to do? That'd be nice to find out. No, the question is not that. The question is, what did God tell me to do? Specifically that I should do. And be careful about. That's how we should understand our practices. Not the opposite. Because if you go the opposite way, well, yeah. I mean, God never said that every Christian should not smoke the cigar at church. Why don't we do it? If we like cigars, why don't we do that? So yeah, we did a lot of stuff we could make up and come up with. But the point is, what we have to think about is, what is God asking us to do when we come together? What is it that He's trying to get out of us? What is it He wants us to do? That's what we need to look at. So I think that's really a good example of that here, I find. So Moses, he didn't go into the promised land. And finally, we end with chapter 34, 9, and this is about Joshua. So just read. Joshua, the son of Nun, was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him. So the people of Israel obeyed him as the Lord had commanded Moses. And there was not risen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, and we talked about that before. None like him, for all the signs and the wonders that the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, all his servants and all his land, and for all the mighty power and all the great deeds of terror that Moses did in the sight of Israel. Yeah. The rabbis say, and this is interesting just to finish on that, the first letter of the Torah is B, and it's the bet, Bereshit, in the beginning. The last letter of the Torah here is the L of Yeshaya. Notice that even in English. If you put those two together, if you put that L and B together, it makes the word, it creates the word lev, which is heart, the heart. So maybe it means, and that's what the rabbis say, that the heart of God is revealed in the Torah. I think that's true, but that is not the final revelation. The Torah is okay. But, I mean, Jesus, the law came through Moses, John 1, verse 14, but truth and grace came through Jesus, the Son of God. Do you know what? Well, I was going to say, the last letter in the New Testament, actually, is what? Is the N. N, and so the whole Bible, if you go to the first letter of the Bible is the B. This is the Messianic Jews say that, they're kind of interesting. The first letter of the Bible is the B, Bereshit. The last letter of the Bible is E. Who has got a Bible? Tell me what the last letter is in the Bible. N. And what does B and N form in Hebrew? Ben, which means son. Interesting. It's all about the Son of God. I like that kind of stuff a little bit. But we could have said a lot of other things. I wanted to talk about this laying on of hands. I didn't have opportunity to do that. Maybe another time. There's a few things to say about that. But generally speaking,